At the German Army's Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, Field Marshal Rommel had been worried for some time. There had been disquieting intelligence reports about a build-up of forces along the coast of England. There was a radio silence in progress. From his days in the desert, he knew that was a sign of things to come. There had been bombing raids on railway yards. Sabotage had increased. But Rommel also knew that for any sort of invasion to succeed, the Allies would need at least 6 days of fine weather. And it had been the hottest Whitsun in France in living memory. Then, on the morning of the 4th of June, 1944, the weather broke. Rommel checked with the forecasters. Winds of force 5 to 7 were predicted, whipping up waves in the channel to 8 feet, too strong for a seaborne landing. The cloud was down to 900 feet, too low for an aerial attack. The pressure was off. And so it was that on the next day, the 5th of June 1944, the Third Reich's Field Marshal Rommel, defender of France, went on leave.
London calling in the home, overseas and European services of the BBC and through United Nations Radio Mediterranean. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
D-Day saw the greatest military operation of all time. There were 2,010 American assault craft, 3,323 British and Canadian. They had assembled in every berth of every port, river and creek from Felixstowe in the North Sea to Milford Haven in Wales. Behind them, another 1,000 ships, jamming the Bristol Channel, the Thames Estuary, the Humber, the Clyde, the Belfast Lough.
At first, white, woolly cloud over which we flew in the brilliant sun. But as we approached the channel, it broke into patches, and through a big gap, I saw the shining blue sea. Not an empty sea, but a sea crowded, infested with craft of every kind. Little ships, fast impatient, scurrying like water beetles to and fro, and leaving a glistening wake behind them. Bigger ships in stately, slow procession, with the sweepers in front, court vessels on the flank. It was a brave, an inspiring sight. Dozens, scores, hundreds of craft lying close inshore. There were the vehicles, making their way inland. A great fire burning to starboard. The guns in action there too, jets and puffs of bursting shells. We are supplying the beaches all right, no doubt of that.
But the operation was fraught with dangers. The decision to invade France was by no means unanimous. Operation Overlord, as it was called, was favoured by the Americans. Author Max Hastings.
I think an awful lot of us, I certainly grew up to believe that D-Day was ordained from an early stage in the war, that somehow it was just bound to happen, that the British and Americans went into France. And yet, when you start to look at the documents, you find by that stage of the war, the British had become very war-weary and, above all, deeply concerned about casualties. The Americans were still amazingly keen. They still had huge reserves of manpower. I mean, their army was working up to its final total of 8.5 million against our total of 2.75 million. And the British knew how good the Germans were in a way that the Americans didn't. The Americans had taken a bit of a hammering in North Africa, and they'd had some bad experiences in Italy. But after all that the British Army had been through since 1939, they knew that the Germans would fight to hold every inch of France. In fact, looking at the SHAEF planning documents before the invasion, that there was never any doubt in any of them. None of the planners ever doubted for a moment the kind of resistance the Germans would put up. And the British, and above all Churchill, were deeply afraid that what might happen after the landings was that the Allies might get locked into a terrible struggle of attrition in Normandy. And even in the winter of 1943, there were still documents going to Washington from the British Chiefs of Staff saying we must not consider the date and the style of Overlord to be absolutely fixed. And of course this annoyed the Americans profoundly, because they were absolutely determined that we must get into Northwest Europe in the summer of 1944. But I'm convinced, and it's borne out by the evidence, that if the Americans had not been so absolutely committed to going into a D-Day in 1944, I don't think D-Day would probably have happened until 1945.
But once the decision had been taken, the preparations began. Sergeant Bert Barker, 263 Field Company Royal Engineers. He'd been a lad at Dunkirk. He'd gone in untrained and green. So had his companions, and they'd paid the cost. This time it was going to be different. They were ready. He'd been put through his paces on the Downs, West Wittering, and Maidstone in Kent.
Previous to the actual, we were trained up and we were preparing explosive charges and ropes for hanging onto the Average, the Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, for shifting the beach defences, and also for exploding the mines or whatever we found on the beaches when we got there. But the Royal Marine Commandos had given us terrific intelligence of the actual beaches we were going into, so really it wasn't quite an unknown situation we were going into. The photographs of by low-light flying aircraft had been taken, and we were shown. We didn't actually know the destination, but by the pictures when we got there, it seemed as if we'd been there before, except that there was a lot of banging and smoke going on.
England has become one vast ordnance dump and field park. In every wood and copse, in leafy dead-end lanes and side roads, often in private gardens, under quarries and embankments, there it all was. Trucks, ambulances, tanks, armoured cars, carriers, jeeps, bulldozers, ducks, vehicles of all kinds. Vast, really vast numbers of them. And great mountains of stores, weapons and ammunition, rations, bridging equipment, tyres, timber, millions of tons. And everywhere today we've met the columns of men in battle dress, men marching, men running, men deploying on exercises, men being transported here and there by the thousand in trucks and lorries, men testing their equipment, tuning up their engines, waterproofing their vehicles, raising great sweeping clouds of yellow dust as their tanks bump and crash along the test tracks. In the whole history of the world, there never has been such a vast concentration of all the paraphernalia of war in so small a space.
Okay, everybody. Well, this is it, boys. Tomorrow's the big show. D-Day is tomorrow. And H hour, when the American and our own forces go into the continent, is sometime early tomorrow morning.
On the eve of this great adventure, I send my best wishes to every soldier in the Allied team. To us is given the honor of striking a blow for freedom which will live in history. And in the better days that lie ahead, men will speak with pride of our doings. We have a great and a righteous cause. Let us pray that the Lord, mighty in battle, will go forth with our armies, and that his special providence will aid us in the struggle. I want every soldier to know that I have complete confidence in the successful outcome of the operations that we are now about to begin. With stout hearts and with enthusiasm for the contest, let us go forward to victory.
In the wardroom, dinner. From the menu, roast beef and green peas and apples and cream, it might have been a crossing to Cherbourg in peacetime. And then you realized that your hand was moving just a little sluggishly to your mouth. Your tummy wasn't just where it usually was. The men around you were rather silent, and when they spoke, they were self-conscious. It was a room full of men on the way, wondering, waiting, and listening. On deck, signals were flashing between ships. Enterprise had run up a flag signal. Boat crews were making their final preparations. There was a tenseness and a sense of good humor and good fellowship that were impossible of translation into words. And now, as the time draws near for darkness, and we sail steadily nearer to the coastline of France, most of those same things are still happening. Every man is wondering, every man is completely calm.